Hello everybody, this is International Master Bryan Smith with ChessLecture.com. I'm starting a new series which will be sort of a partner to the Nimzo Indian series. And that one, well, we did look at it from both sides' point of view, but with a bias toward black somewhat, because that's the side I was playing. And in that one, we were looking, of course, at the Nimzo Indian move order c4, e6, and after knight c3, bishop b4. So there was a request to make a series to go along with it, focusing on white's other moves here, after which black can play the Benoni. So knight f3 or g3, both black can play c5. Of course, there's other moves, but this is what I'm going to focus on in this series. This is basically part of my opening repertoire when I play this way. If white plays knight c3, Nimzo Indian, and if white plays knight f3 or g3, then Benoni, although sometimes I use this bishop b4 check, the Bogo Indian. So that's what I'm going to, well, not recommend, but focus on. This is a matter of taste, of course, which opening you play. But if you want to play the Benoni, why not just do it immediately? Well, there's a couple reasons. Here, okay, white plays d5, e6, knight c3, e takes d5, c takes d5, d6. Notice that the f pawn is not blocked. White's knight has not come out on f3 yet. So this means that he has several other options. He can play the four pawns attack, or whatever this is called, the flick knife attack, people call it, with bishop b5 check. It's a very dangerous system. Not fatal for black, but dangerous, and a lot of people try to avoid it. And so if you use the Nimzo Indian, you can avoid this system if you only play the Benoni after knight f3. Another thing is f3 move, kind of a little bit, let's say, annoying system where white solidifies e4 and develops his pieces bishop g5, knight e2, or maybe knight h3 to f2. You avoid this system as well if your knight is already out on f3. And finally, this bishop d3, knight e2 system. Very dangerous attacking system where white puts the knight on g3 and plays f4, and then e5 as a pawn sacrifice later on in the game, of course. This also you avoid. Now, you obviously can play against all these systems, and none of them are really fatal, but a lot of Benoni players prefer to play it only in the event of knight f3. It's much safer. And since I did the Nimzo Indian series, then, I'm going to focus on this position and also g3, which g3 further cuts down white's options, because after c5, if he's going to play d5, he's really required to play the fianchetto variation only, because pawn is already on g3. Okay, our first video is going to be an introduction to the basic themes of the Benoni, and who better to introduce us to the Benoni than the former world champion Mikhail Tal. He was the first big Benoni practitioner who is consistently playing it at a high level, and he really introduced it to top-level chess back in the late 50s and early 60s. It was his weapon. It was his buddy on the path to the world championship. Earlier, some strong players had used the Benoni, in particular Frank Marshall, but Tal was the one who really made it into a weapon. And not surprisingly, when you got an opening that is basically sound, I mean, it's not an absurd opening. The Benoni is maybe not considered the most correct opening, but it's a sound weapon that's highly regarded enough, it's not some loopy stuff, and it's virtually new and very full of rich themes. You're going to win a lot of games with it very easily, and that's what happened. Like, for instance, this game, his opponent was Grandmaster Jan-Hein Donner, who, well, he didn't really go down in history as, one of the top players, but he was a grandmaster of his day, and he was, I guess, one of the top players in the world, although the whole scene was different back then. There were just far fewer players, especially from the West, competing at the top level. But this was a grandmaster, but he just looks like an amateur in this game because the themes of the Benoni were new, and Tal understood the themes and knew what he was doing, and Donner was he had no guidelines at all. There was no theory in the variation, really, not very much, and he just didn't really know how to create a reasonable plan here. Okay, so now in this game, Tal did use the c5 move order, which obviously is quite playable, but just to look at, our move order and the most common Benoni move order nowadays, here, of course, white doesn't have to play d5, as he doesn't have to if black plays c5 immediately. So if you want to use this as your repertoire, you have to also look at the move g3, going into an English. C takes d4, knight takes d4. Now it's perfectly reasonable variation of the English, and one line, which I believe Tall also played, is this. Black takes over the center, and future probably creates a passed pawn. The normal line is knight f3 and now d4. The point is that if knight takes e5, black checks on a5. So this allows black to create a strong wedge of pawns in the center, which of course white also has counterplay against, but it leads to a sharp and interesting game. There are other ways to play here. I'm not going to go into this so much yet. This is not the focus of the series. There's also, for instance, queen c7 taking aim at the c4 pawn and others. And also, similar to this, you have to also look into knight c3, which is a similar type of thing, although this allows black to transpose into a variation of the Nimzo Indian. And finally, there's the move e3, kind of a slow system, sort of, I guess, a sort of collie in a way. And there are various ways for black to answer this. Many different ways. d5 transposes to a Tarish defense. There's moves like d6, keeping it in Indian type of setup. b6 has been played, I think, and you can transpose into a Caro-Kann by taking on d4 followed by d5. So there's various different choices here. But anyway, going back to our main game, Tall played c5, and now here again, if you play it this way, you also have to deal with knight f3. Here black has an interesting gambit. He can play e takes, knight takes, e5, knight b5, and now d5, c takes d5, and bishop c5, called the Vaganian gambit, which Kasparov played. Okay. But, as is most common, white played d5, and 90% of the time or more, white's going to do that. Black played e6, so we're going into a modern Benoni, where black exchanges the e-pawn for the d-pawn, knight c3, e takes, c takes, d6, blocking white's d-pawn, knight f3. Now, this is not a whole theoretical survey. We're focusing on the themes here. So, as I said before, white could leave his f-pawn unblocked and play a number of other different systems, but this was a perfectly natural move. g6, e4, white takes over the center. Now, the main thing in the Benoni is one of the main things is the opposing pawn majorities. White has 2 pawns to 1 in the center. And this is a huge thing. If white can break through with e5, it could be very bad for black. On the other hand, black has 3 against 2 on the queen side. So he's got his own pawn majority and his own plan to try to play b5. Additionally, black can put pressure in the center on the e4 pawn by attacking with rook e8 or using the e5 square in some cases. And we're going to see these themes. And notice that black's queenside majority, the 3 against 2, once the bishop comes to g7, it's going to be nicely supporting that majority. So white can be in some serious trouble on the queen side if he's not accurate. Okay, continuing. Bishop g7, bishop d3, an active square for the bishop to develop to. However, nowadays, white usually, if he wants to develop the bishop there, first plays h3 in order to prevent black from doing what he did in this game, playing bishop g4 and trading off his light-squared bishop. Now, why would black want to just trade off a bishop for a knight so early in the game without even doubling white's pawns or anything? Normally, you don't do this. We were just focusing on the Nimzo Indian in the series that I did before, where black, in some cases, comes into serious trouble for just exchanging his bishop, even if white gets double pawns. And sometimes even though white loses a lot of time in making black make this exchange. Now, why here does white waste a tempo with h3 most often nowadays in order to prevent black from trading off his bishop at his own cost of time without even doubling white's pawns or making white lose any time? Well, the answer lies in the particular features of the position. In this position, black's pieces mostly have good squares to develop to. Bishop on g7 is simply a phenomenal piece. The knight on f6 is very good, placed in the center. The other knight will probably go to d7, maybe a6 and then c7, where from d7 it guards e5, can jump into e5 easily. From c7 it prepares b5. There are various possibilities for that knight. The black rook is going to go to e8 once he castles. The other rook, well, has various options. There's one piece which black has a real problem with finding a square for, and that is the bishop on c8. And the problem is, where can this bishop go? It can't go to f5 or e6. On d7, it just gets in the way more often than not. It's blocking the square from the knight. And fianchettoing it is just stupid usually because white's pawns on d5 and e4 are just a really serious barrier. So black wants to trade off this bishop specifically because he has got the rest of his pieces, he has no problem with them. They're will be very well placed. They all have natural squares. He's made some sacrifice in order to get this situation, though, because normally when you're black, your pieces all can't find perfectly good squares. Usually there's something that has to be wrong with your position, or else your opponent just made a mistake in the opening. So in order to get such a situation where all of his pieces can work together and be active, black has sacrificed space. And he's made this bishop on c8 the one piece which doesn't work. So he trades off the bishop, if possible, for white's knight on f3, which helps white to control the center. And therefore, black is able to keep better control over e5, so preventing white's dangerous breakthrough, and reduce the number of pieces, which is very important if you have less space. Generally, minor piece trades in the Benoni are usually good for black as long as you're not trading off your dark squared bishop. So that's the basic thing. Now, is black going to suffer because of white's two bishops? There are some scenarios where that can happen. This is definitely a possibility, but they're less common than in the Nimzo-Indian because the position is pretty blocked, and control of specific squares is very important here, rather than lines. The e5 square is very important. The control of b5, whether black can push b5, and as we'll see, he manages to play c4 and put a piece into c5. And in order to play c4, well, it's best that white doesn't have a knight that can jump into d4. So basically, the two bishops, somehow, it's a little bit hard for white to use them in this position, much harder than in a lot of Nimzo-Indian positions. Okay, so white played bishop d3, though, and he allowed black to make this exchange, which Tal didn't do immediately. Black castled, which is a perfectly natural move. But I think a lot of modern players here would play a6 first, with a positional threat of playing b5, activating the queenside majority. Now, white could allow that, but this would be some sort of gain for black. Normal response would be a4, and then bishop g4, not giving white a second chance to play h3. I've played this way, for instance. Now, why doesn't black just play bishop g4 immediately? Well, the answer is that white has a very annoying move, queen a4 check. And what does black do to get out of that check? Natural response would be knight to d7, developing a piece. But now comes knight to d2, and white has avoided the exchange. Not only avoided the exchange, but also now bishop on g4 is hanging out in midair and is threatened with simply being trapped by playing f3 or h3 and g4 if the bishop retreats to h5. How does black save the bishop? I don't actually see any way at the moment. I guess g5, but that's pretty ugly. You don't want to play that move. So, meanwhile, if black blocks with his bishop, then comes queen b3, and white has again avoided the trade. He's hitting b7, forcing black to spend another tempo guarding b7. That's also a problem for black. And moving the king is not ideal, and again, white can play knight to d2, and of course, if queen to d7, then comes bishop b5, winning material. So this is why black plays a6 first, with the threat of playing b5, not forcing, but inducing the move a4, and then bishop g4. And black manages to achieve his goal, which is to exchange the bishop for the knight. Now, without understanding that black should try to do this, who would ever think of playing these moves? But this is how theory develops. Players begin to understand the position, understand that it's good to trade the bishop for the knight in this situation, and then find the tactical method to do it. And Tal, well, it's his early game. This was 1959. He just castled, and probably a lot of people would do that nowadays too, giving white a second chance to play h3, which he could have played anyway. He didn't do that, but h3 here would transpose into one of the crucial lines of the Benoni, which we'll be covering later. He instead just castled, a routine natural move. Now Tal played a6. I don't see any reason why he couldn't play bishop g4 immediately now. But he did this, which is often a useful move anyway. And white played a4, stopping the b5 move. And bishop g4. So this pin white found annoying, so he just played h3 to trade the bishop for the knight. Now, Donner's, he's a natural player, and this was quite a while ago. The Benoni was new. He's just playing the normal moves according to classical principles. He's gained space in the center, developed his pieces normally. Now he's going to force the trade of a bishop for a knight with no real obvious compensation for black. But it turns out that everything he does in this game is wrong. So this is kind of interesting. Now, he's not totally gone wrong at this point, but I already would say this is a pretty comfortable variation for black. Okay, so Tal, of course, took on f3, queen takes, now knight to d7, and bishop f4. So he develops all of his pieces, natural squares, and we'll see that his game collapses quickly. Here, okay, Tal played queen c7. So he's guarding his d-pawn, of course. Now knight e5. Would this be good or not to allow it to make this trade? White would take on e5, and black would take back. No, normally for black to get white's dark squared bishop would be excellent. And however, this pawn on e5 is a big problem in black's position. And moving the pawn from d6 to e5 has not improved his position at all. Now you may be saying, okay, if you're a more advanced player, you say, okay, black's going to blockade with his knight, come to d6, blockade the passed pawn, and get a good-looking position. Play f5 in the future. And there are many situations where such a blockading knight, followed by advancing a majority of pawns, could be good. However, here it's not so good, this situation. And the main reason is because of the c5 pawn also. This pawn is weak, and white here probably plays a5, separating this pawn, and now there's knight a4 moves coming in the future. And basically, black's position doesn't have any dynamicism, and white can attack the queen side pretty easily. Attack to c5, maybe even prepare b4 in the future. All these things are going to take some preparation, but black doesn't have a whole lot of counterplay. His knight may look good on d6, but that's about it. So generally there are situations, of course, where that's a good trade for black, but not here, I would say. So he just guarded his c-pawn, and meanwhile his queen on c7 supports c4 in the future. Okay, white went queen e2. So he is figuring his queen needs to move eventually. And he's preventing c4. Now rook f to e8. Lining up his rook, putting his rook on a good open file, facing white's queen, controlling e5. Bishop to h2. Okay, white's having trouble finding a plan. He's done everything according to classical principles, what he should do. But now he needs to find a plan, and he looks around and there isn't much of one. Well, I guess he wants to go f4 and e5, but is that going to be possible? I doubt it. But it's hard to give advice. What kind of plan can white make here? Maybe a5. But at some point, black is going to play the move b5, probably first supported with a rook. White will take on b6, the rook will take back, and white's b2 will be weak, black's a6 will be weak, but I would say black will have a pretty decent position there. And there are other ways black can play rook to c8, followed by c4 rather, and knight c5. But I think white should probably interrupt black's play somehow by playing a5, I would say, around here. He played bishop h2. Now rook to c8. This is an interesting move. How does black continue from here? He needs to find a plan as well. So he puts his rook here, and it's clear that he's intending to play c4. Now, why does he want to play c4? Well, he wants to advance his queenside majority, and he also wants to open up the c5 square for his knight. So this is a typical plan. Now, when you play c4 in the Benoni, this gives up white the d4 square. So you have to be watching out, especially if white has a knight on f3, and especially if black has pushed his b-pawn also to b5, for instance, that white isn't able to just bring the knight to d4 and then maybe to c6. This is something you need to watch out for. Here, however, that's not going to happen. So black can, as long as his c-pawn is safe, he can happily push it to c4. White went bishop c4, so he mechanically stopped the c4 move. If white played rook to c1, I think black still plays c4 maybe. I would probably prefer rook to c1, something like that. Maybe other rook, probably other rook. And c4, bishop c2. Or there's also, instead of rook c1, maybe rook b1. But in any case, this type of thing possibly black would do. And then some move like queen to c5, intending put the queen on b4 and play b5 is one possible plan. Queen attacks b2, it guards d6. So that's one thing that could possibly happen. But instead he played bishop c4, just stopping black from playing c4 himself. He's trying to prevent black's plan, but ultimately it doesn't work. So now knight e5. Black wants to challenge c4. And now, of course, Donner does not want to take that knight. I don't know if he was operating under the illusion that he has an advantage, because according to classical principles, maybe he does. But when you look at the board, what problem does black have? None, really, and he has an easier time finding a plan, too. So anyway, white didn't want to take on e5, of course, giving away his crucial bishop. This would be opposite-colored bishops. If he did this, of course, the rook would take. But this type of situation is not a drawish opposite-colored bishop situation. Black can put a lot of pressure on the dark squares. His bishop is much better than white's. He's going to put pressure on the e-pawn, rook to e8. He has moves like queen to b6 coming, putting pressure on b2. Queen coming to b4, where it would probably sit pretty nice. So it's by no means a drawish position, even though they're opposite-colored bishops, because there's lots of pieces on the board. Okay, so white played f4. So he wants to push in the center. He has the center majority, so he wants to push the pawns, but it's not going to happen. But what advice can you give? Maybe more combative, to retreat the bishop and try to keep that piece on the board. Probably black plays c4 with the knight coming into d3, but maybe this can somehow be undermined. So he plays f4. f4, I would say, weakens his position too much for this situation, and the bishop on h2 is not going to be playing either. He's not going to manage to play e5, so this is just going to be too exposed. So black took on f4. Queen took. Now a strong move. White wants to play e5 and blow black off the board, basically. This is what would happen. Black cannot allow this, so he plays knight to d7. Very important. Guarding the e5 square. He also opens up his dark squared bishop. Now, the important thing to realize is here white has control over e5. If it was his move, he would play e5 and black would probably just be crushed. Or, well, he would be in trouble, I think. But by making this move knight to d7, black has added not one but two guards to e5. The bishop and the knight all at once stopping e5, and white cannot bring up enough pieces to ever support e5. The only way he could play e5 is as a pawn sacrifice, by going e5, d takes c5, f5. And this is a theme that emerged later, which was discovered. The idea is it's a seal or sweeper, and the knight comes to e4 afterwards. White's down a pawn, but he's blocked black's everything by the e5 on e5, and he's meanwhile creating threats on the king side on the f-file. This was used in a game between Penrose and Tall somewhat later, after Tall just became world champion. So if Donner had discovered such an idea, how would Tall have met it? That would have been interesting. He would like to play e4 and open up his bishop again, but of course that pawn is pinned. So just on first glance, it looks like some move like queen to b6 might be good. I think that white's position wasn't so good from the start, and probably this sacrifice will be insufficient. But it would definitely create complications, and trying to get the initiative back is very important. Besides queen b6, if you don't want to allow d6 move, maybe knight to f6 is also a possibility. Guarding e4 and blocking the f7 pawn. Still, this was by far white's best practical chance, I would say. So he went rook e1 supporting e5 supposedly, but that's not going to happen. And Tal played queen b6. So this was a very good move. All of his pieces are working now. He's attacking b2, and it's not just the pawn, but this is the base of white's position. If that pawn goes, his knight has no longer any support, and black's pawns will rush forward. He's also stepping his queen out of the view of white's bishop from b2. Rook b1, so white guarded the pawn. And now queen b4, another very strong move. Black is taking up space by offering a queen trade, which is not something what white wants. I'm sure by now Donner realized that the supposed virtues of the position are now gone. He no longer has two bishops. His center is only visually impressive, but really it's under pressure. His queen side is falling apart. He saw that he couldn't trade queens here because after black takes back, suddenly the open c file is very important. The knight is chased away from c3 where it guards the center. If he plays knight a2, simplest is probably just a5. And now black is ready for rook c2, coming in on the c file. Knight c5, attacking both a4, very weak pawn, and e4, another very weak pawn at the same time. And white can't deal with all these things at once. Not to mention that his rook is tied down to b2, because the bishop on g7 is attacking b2, and the knight is offsides on a2. This is a terrible position. If the knight goes elsewhere, it's also bad. Knight d1, for instance, doesn't even attack b4, so black could immediately win material by knight c5, or he could play rook c2. And a Benoni player nowadays could play this in a blitz game. I mean, this is completely natural stuff for a Benoni player who's even not a very strong one. You know, all these themes are pretty easy to understand. But at the time, they were totally new, so even a grandmaster could just lose routinely like this. Okay, queen f1. So he avoided the queen trade, and now c4. So black made his pawn push. Now he's getting ready to activate his knight from d7. Most important thing is the activity of the pieces, and this knight needs to be activated. He's also preparing to play b5 to advance his pawn majority by cutting off the queen's guard of b5. Rook e2. Okay, well, it's really hard to give advice for white at this moment. So he's guarding b2, maybe preparing to double his rooks and play e5 in some sort of fantasy land. There's not much advice that can be given here, except that probably his position is already compromised enough that it's time to mix it up. Maybe some move like f5, trying to at least create some threats on the king side. Black could respond by bishop b4 check and then knight e5. f5, of course, has the really big downside that it gives away the e5 square for black's knight. And, of course, that's important. But at least white gets some sort of hope of some sort. I don't know if it's very much, but it's a chance to create some random threats against black's king. But Donner didn't do that. Maybe another possibility was, again, to try to use this theme, which was only discovered later. e5, d takes e5, f5, the sealer sweeper. And here, this I would say definitely poses more practical difficulties for black than what white did. So knowing these themes, this is a very important one to know. I mean, white hasn't done anything right in this game, but in this position, let's say he still has his chances. You know, black is in good shape, but white has at least some counterplay. If he can put his knight to e4, or maybe push f6, or somehow take, he's got to pass d-pawn. Okay, black's clearly in control, but it's not over yet. He played rook e2, a passive move. b5. So black advances on the queen side. White took, and black took back, and now king h1. He just doesn't know what to do. Again, maybe he should try f5, or again this e5, d takes e5, f5 idea. Although as the game goes along, pretty soon that no longer is going to save him. Now black took on c3, a surprising decision normally. He gives away his fianchettoed bishop, leaving weak dark squares in its wake. this is supposed to be black's best piece, but the concrete considerations here took precedence. Black does this in order to further along his play. He is creating a passed c-pawn now. He's not winning a pawn, because after white takes back and the queen takes, white will take on b5. But what happens is black's queen becomes very active, black's c-pawn becomes immensely strong, and white's bishop on h2, the unopposed dark-squared bishop, is just a pathetic piece. And white loses the one left piece that can guard his light squares, the knight on c3, and that means that e4 crumbles. Okay, white has to take, black takes. So the moral is, well, in the Benoni, you have to be very careful with giving up your dark-squared bishop. But in many situations, that's exactly what you do, and this is one of them. Rook takes b5, queen to d3, strong move. Black pins white's rook and attacks e4. And also there's another hidden attack on b5 as well, when black pushes his c-pawn. So white can't really do much now. He played queen to e1. When things are going really bad, it's just time for some desperation, and e5 would be at least the only chance that I can, maybe the best chance to at least create some sort of complications, maybe some chance that there will be something on the king side. Black would probably play c3, attacking the rook. Rook would retreat, and then can take a d-pawn, queen e1. Some sort of, it's pretty hopeless, but what advice can you give? Okay, so he played instead queen e1. Black played c3, attacking the rook on b5, which retreated to the back rank. And now knight c5, and white threw in the towel. Still even material, but black is completely dominating. e4 is falling. If white pushes e5, which ironically, he is right at the point of the consummation of his opening plan, which classical principles dictated he should do. He has a center pawn majority. He has the two bishops. He should crash through in the center with e5. But just at the point of where he's about to do this, he decides he has to resign, because now black's play comes first. c2, rook moves to c1, and then knight to b3. And there's nothing white can do. The rook is lost, and not just the rook, but black's c-pawn is also going through. Also, if after knight c5, if white attacks the queen with rook to d1, then c2 is again decisive. Attacking the rook on d1, if white takes the queen, black just takes back with the knight, and he's down a queen for a moment, but black's about to queen his pawn and get the queen back. And meanwhile, white's queen is also under attack. So that's hopeless. And otherwise, if he does nothing, black just either plays c2 and knight b3, or just takes e4, and white's position crumbles immediately. So I hope this has been a useful introduction to the themes of the Benoni from the first great Benoni master, Michal Tal. And in the later videos, we'll be looking at some more specific themes for both sides, just as I did in the Nimzo-Indian series. And we'll be looking at some more modern games as well. Okay, this has been International Master Bryan Smith with ChessLecture.com.